that this community of nations can deliver a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world to the next generation. Thank you very much.
42 minutes on the clock. Two major issues, Syria and also the country of Iran. With regard to Syria, the president saying it's gotten a lot of attention. Assad is responsible, quote, an insult to think that anyone else carried out that chemical attack. He also says $340 million will go toward more humanitarian support in that country. That is one headline. With regard to Iran, and much of this speech, frankly, was centered on Iran, the president talking about the relationship between the U.S. and Iran for the better part of 3 decades. The mistrust has deep roots, but America prefers to resolve this peacefully, appointing John Kerry Secretary of State to pursue a nuclear weapons agreement. Two comments earlier in the speech that perhaps will get a lot of attention. Number one, the world is more stable than it was 5 years ago. He said that right before remarking on the ongoing situation in Kenya, where he talked about terrorists targeting innocent civilians and suicide bombers taking out Christians in Pakistan just this week. He did not mention that Christians were the targets, and he did not mention that Muslims were the terrorists in either Kenya or Pakistan. Many will pick up on both those points as we go throughout the day. Here's Martha now with more.
All right, let's get straight to some reaction to all of that with John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and Fox News contributor. So you were listening along with us, Ambassador. What did you think?
Well, it was a long, meandering speech, a very self-referential defense of the past 4.5 years of the administration's policy. In many respects, not a lot that was new. But on the key points, I think there were 3: Syria, Iran, the Arab-Israeli issue. On Syria, a fairly remarkable criticism of Russia and Iran right there in the General Assembly for supporting the Assad regime. I thought it was notable. It's certainly true that they've kept Assad in power. How that's going to help get a Security Council resolution to deal with the Syrian chemical weapons issue, somewhat hard to discern. On Iran, very clear now, we are about to enter a lengthy diplomatic process, negotiations that could stretch as far as the eye could see on the nuclear weapons program. I think that essentially guarantees that Iran is free from the threat of certainly a U.S. military strike. Pressure will now go to Israel to see what they do. The thing that was most striking about the president's comments on Iran was the moral equivalency with which he viewed the differences between the two countries. You know, Iranians have their suspicions about American interference during the Cold War. Americans have their suspicions because of taking hostages and killing Americans in Iraq. And that's all sort of the same thing. We need to work that through. That, to me, is not a very sound approach for an American president going into negotiations. And then on the Arab-Israeli conflict, where I don't think there was much new on substance, the president again used a phrase that I think colors his view of how this issue should be resolved. He talked about, his phrase, the occupation of the West Bank, which is a way of saying that all of the territory beyond the 67 borders that Israel controls is occupied territory, which has essentially been the Palestinian position for a long time. So I think it was striking how the 95% of the speech was on the Middle East. Not much of a pivot to Asia, which the president had talked about before, and I think it's a roadmap for the next couple of years how the administration will proceed.
No mention of radical Islamic Jihad when he talked about what's going on in Kenya.
Right, that's not a problem. It's really Israeli apartment construction in East Jerusalem and that sort of thing. I think this was a very clear view of the president's take on the world, of what his assessment is.
We've got to leave it there. Ambassador, thank you very much. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.